Hey guys, tonight we wander back to a world that looks nothing like the one you know. Imagine stepping outside your front door, no gleaming police cars, no street lamps glowing, no comforting blue and red flashing lights ready to sweep in. The streets are shadows and whispers. You're alone, or so it feels, in a medieval town where law enforcement is something you invent for yourself. You probably won't survive this unarmed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a quick comment telling me your location and local time. It's a small reminder that while we explore centuries past, you're right here, cozy and safe, or at least safer than our medieval ancestors. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a dirt path, dust swirling in the chill evening air, and the only sounds are the distant bark of a dog and your own footsteps. There are no street lamps, no police sirens, only the occasional flicker of a torch from a distant window. Welcome to a time when police was a foreign concept, an idea yet to be invented. Instead, protection was woven into the very fabric of society, but fragile, imperfect, and often brutal. In medieval Europe, the absence of formal police forces meant the idea of personal and communal responsibility ruled. You can almost feel the prickling unease. Any noise, any shadow could be a threat. Thieves, bandits, wild animals, or worse. The idea of relying on a uniformed stranger to rescue you from danger? Not a thing. Instead, safety came from your lord's men, your neighbors' watchful eyes, and your own quick reflexes. You might think medieval towns were lawless chaos, but historians still argue whether things were more orderly than popular imagination suggests. Some villages had surprisingly strict unwritten codes, enforced by the whole community. Others descended into near anarchy after dusk. Here's a quirky fact for you. Did you know that some medieval people actually believed carrying a bit of crocodile dung could protect you from evil spirits? Yeah, it sounds wild, but that's the kind of security system some trusted over their sword or spear. Not exactly a badge of law enforcement, but hey, to each their own. Back then, the concept of crime prevention was communal. If you were a farmer, your neighbors counted on you to watch the fields at night, armed with little more than a stick or a rusty blade. Patrols were informal and voluntary, and the idea of a dedicated cop was decades, even centuries away. Without centralized law enforcement, justice was often swift and public. Crimes were dealt with through local courts, public shaming, or harsher punishments designed to send a message. There was no 911, no patrol car to call. Your survival depended on the strength of your community ties and the sharpness of your blade. Imagine having to rely on a town crier or a bell toll to warn you of danger. No phones, no radios, no instant alerts. That sense of vulnerability was real, and it shaped the rhythms of medieval life profoundly. The night was not just dark, it was dangerous. Yet life went on. Markets bustled by day, towns grew, and people built the fortresses and castles that stood as beacons of protection. The absence of police didn't mean absence of order, but it did mean order was fragile and often brutal. So, while you sit there comfortably, maybe sipping your tea or scrolling your phone, remember, in a world without police, safety was a patchwork quilt, sewn from loyalty, fear, and a bit of superstition. That's the stage for the story we'll unravel tonight. You lean into the story's flow as the medieval world unfolds around you. A place where lords hold the reins of power, but their grip on safety is anything but guaranteed. In those days, protection wasn't a service sold by a government department. It was a bargaining chip traded between you and your lord. The feudal system was the original security contract, but instead of monthly fees, you paid with loyalty, labor, or even your blood. Your lord's manor looms nearby, a stone sentinel guarding not only his own family, but the scattered villages and farmlands surrounding it. This powerful figure commands retainers, armed men sworn to fight, defend, and enforce the Lord's will. They're the medieval version of a security detail, but with a penchant for swords over badges. If you think your neighborhood watch is intense, imagine a posse of heavily armored knights and squires ready to descend at the first sign of trouble. This protection comes at a price: your allegiance and service. You farm the Lord's land, you pay taxes, often in the form of crops or labor, and in return, his men might show up to fend off marauding bandits or settle disputes. It's a messy deal, wrapped in rigid hierarchy and often brutal enforcement. Your life's security is tethered to the whims of someone who could be as protective as a lion or as ruthless as a wolf. Here's an intriguing detail. Some lords kept specialized forces like archers or mounted knights who could respond faster and with deadly precision. But many smaller landowners relied on local militias, peasants pressed into service, often poorly trained but fiercely loyal. Historians still argue whether these militias were effective or just a recipe for chaos, as many times they were as dangerous to the villagers as to outsiders. Imagine the psychological weight of this system. Your safety depends on a man you may never meet in person, and his hired muscle might be strangers who show up only when summoned. The trust between lord and serf was a fragile thread, woven with fear and necessity. The idea of a contract was as much about mutual dependency as about power imbalance. On a lighter note, some lords fancied themselves as early police chiefs. They issued edicts and had local courts to handle disputes. But the idea of impartial justice was murky at best. Justice often meant what benefited the lord, not the common folk. It was less protect and serve and more protect my property and taxes. You might be surprised to learn that in some regions, lords competed to offer better protection, almost like early insurance companies. They'd build thicker walls, station more men, and host festivals to boost loyalty. It's medieval marketing with chainmail and maces. So, while you imagine knights in shining armor galloping to your rescue, remember, this protection was patchy, personal, and often brutal. You lived on your lord's mercy, and sometimes that was the only law you knew. You step into the humbler world beyond castles and lords, where protection is less about swords and more about simple vigilance. In the villages scattered across the medieval landscape, safety wasn't outsourced. It was everyone's job. The village watch, a rotating cast of locals armed with whatever they could muster, kept a wary eye on the fields and streets once the sun dipped below the horizon. Picture yourself pulling a thin cloak tight against the night chill, clutching a wooden staff or maybe a rusty spear, squinting through the darkness. Your job? To patrol the same dirt roads and thatched rooftops you call home, to spot any threat, be it a prowling thief, a pack of wolves, or a rival clan. There's no magic app alerting you to danger, no radio to call for backup. It's just you, your neighbors, and a whole lot of hope. The village watch wasn't a glamorous gig. It was often tedious, cold, and lonely. But without it, life could quickly unravel. These watchmen were sometimes volunteers, sometimes conscripted, but always essential. They walked the fine line between protector and suspect, because, let's be honest, when everyone has a club, it's hard to know who's really guarding the village and who might be looking for trouble. Interestingly, some villages used a system called beating the bounds, where the watch or community members walked the perimeter of their land to mark boundaries and scare off encroachers. This ritual doubled as a security check and a way to pass down local knowledge. Historians still argue whether such customs were more symbolic or practical, but it shows how intertwined protection was with daily life. You might chuckle at the idea that some villagers armed themselves with nothing more sophisticated than pitchforks or even farm tools. Yet these improvised weapons were effective deterrents, and a reminder that everyone had to be ready to defend their own patch of earth. The armory was often just the barn or the kitchen, and training was informal. You learned by doing or watching your father. A quirky tidbit for you. In some communities, it was tradition for the watch to ring a bell or blow a horn to signal danger or summon help. But if the bell ringer was too enthusiastic, or just plain clumsy, everyone else might end up wide awake for no reason. False alarms were the medieval equivalent of your neighbor's dog barking at a squirrel at 3 a.m. Without a centralized police force, the village watch system was a patchwork quilt, sometimes reliable, often inconsistent, but always vital. It created a shared responsibility, a social contract that bound neighbors together by more than just property lines. As you imagine standing guard under the stars, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing in, it's clear that medieval safety was a collective effort. And whether it kept you safe or simply gave you peace of mind, the village watch was the frontline defense in a world where danger lurked just beyond the firelight. As you keep moving through this medieval landscape, your eyes naturally drift to the towering silhouettes that break the horizon. Castles. These stone giants aren't just grand homes for lords. They're the medieval equivalent of neighborhood security hubs, fortresses of protection in a lawless time. If you've ever wondered how safety worked without police, castles answer part of that question with their thick walls, narrow windows, and deep moats. You approach one, hearing the clang of a heavy portcullis sliding open and the distant clatter of armored boots. Castles were designed not just to impress, but to intimidate and defend. When trouble brewed, whether bandits, rival lords, or rebellious peasants, villagers could seek refuge behind those walls, and the lord's men could mount a defense. Inside the walls, you find a microcosm of medieval society. Soldiers training, servants scurrying, and blacksmiths hammering out weapons and armor. Castles were both a home and a military base, often built on high ground to dominate the surrounding lands. Their presence was a constant reminder that protection wasn't free. It came at the cost of submission and loyalty. Historians still argue how effective castles really were at providing security for the common folk. Some say castles were more symbolic, representing power rather than practical defense, while others point to numerous successful sieges and defensive stands as proof of their importance. A quirky fact: some castles had surprisingly elaborate garderobes, medieval toilets that cleverly used gravity and water to dispose of waste, often into the castle moat or a nearby river, an early, if unsanitary, form of pest control. Not exactly a protection tactic, but hey, every castle had its secrets. These fortresses were also administrative centers where local disputes were settled and law was enforced, albeit often harshly. Your protection inside a castle wasn't just physical, it was political too. The lord's justice, sometimes swift and brutal, was carried out within these stone walls. Of course, not everyone could access a castle easily. For many villagers, castles were distant, unreachable fortresses. Protection came in the shadow of their ramparts, but not within them. So while the lord and his knights slept safe behind thick walls, you might still face dangers in the village fields or forest paths. Castles also served as symbols of power to deter troublemakers. The looming presence of a stone fortress was meant to discourage attacks, like a giant, silent cop on the beat. But when those defenses failed, the consequences were catastrophic. You might picture a knight in shining armor charging out of the gates to save the day, but the reality was often less heroic. Many castles relied heavily on diplomacy, alliances, and reputation to maintain peace. And when the siege engines rolled in, it was often about who had the most resources rather than just brute strength. So castles were more than homes. They were medieval security hubs, part refuge, part courtroom, part deterrent. And in a world without police, they were one of the few places where law and order had a fighting chance. You drift now toward the softer light of the church steeple, a different kind of fortress, not built of stone and mortar, but of faith and community influence. In a world without police, the church wielded surprising power over peacekeeping and moral order. The monastery and parish were more than places of worship. They were centers of guidance, sanctuary, and sometimes enforcement. Picture the village priest, a figure who not only delivered sermons but also mediated disputes, delivered moral judgments, and offered sanctuary to those fleeing danger. The church doors were often open to shelter anyone in need, a medieval safe house of sorts. But sanctuary was a double-edged sword. Some abusers took advantage of this protection, leading to tensions between church law and secular justice. Interestingly, monasteries were sometimes fortified themselves, blending the spiritual with the defensive. Monks could be as tough as knights, especially when their treasure or sacred relics were at stake. Historians still argue whether the church's role was mainly spiritual or if it was an early form of community policing in disguise. Here's a quirky detail. Some monks kept beehives within their walls, believing bees symbolized the soul's diligence and order, so much so that bee stings were sometimes used as a bizarre form of discipline. Not your typical policing method, but effective in its own stingy way. The church's moral authority influenced how communities handled crime and punishment. Confession wasn't just spiritual. It was part of an informal justice system where sins could translate into reparations or penance. This blurred the lines between spiritual redemption and societal order. The clergy also maintained records of disputes, births, deaths, and marriages, acting as the community's unofficial registry. Their word could sway a village's opinion, lending weight to accusations or exonerations. In a world lacking formal police reports, the priest's testimony was often crucial. Additionally, church bells served as early alarm systems, ringing to warn of invasions, fires, or unrest. The sound could rally villagers to gather or seek refuge. In a sense, the church was the town's communication hub. No mobile alerts, just the tolling bells echoing across the landscape. Yet the church's power wasn't always benevolent. It could enforce harsh moral codes, sometimes punishing minor offenses with surprising severity. Heresy trials, public penance, and even exile fell under its jurisdiction, wielding fear alongside faith. As you imagine the flickering candlelight inside a quiet chapel, it's clear that in the absence of police, the church filled many roles: judge, protector, and sometimes the only refuge you had when danger came knocking. You settle into the rhythm of medieval life, where justice was less about courts full of lawyers and more about the community's eyes and voices. Without police, the system depended heavily on public involvement, and the punishments, well, let's just say there was little room for subtlety. Community justice was raw, often performed in public squares where everyone could watch, judge, and sometimes participate. Imagine standing in the village center as the accused is brought forward. The crowd gathers, a mix of neighbors, family, and sometimes wandering travelers. The trial might not look like a modern courtroom drama. It's more a spectacle with harsh consequences. Public shaming, stocks, and even corporal punishments were common. The goal wasn't just to punish, but to deter others by making an example of the wrongdoer. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, the community used ducking stools to punish gossipers or scolds, people, usually women, accused of being too loud or troublesome. They were dunked into ponds repeatedly, a watery warning that you probably wouldn't want to test. Talk about a hostile neighborhood watch. Historians still argue whether these public punishments effectively reduced crime or simply fostered resentment and cycles of violence. There was a real risk of innocent people being caught up in mob justice, with little chance to defend themselves properly. You also had the ordeal system, where the accused underwent painful tests, like holding a red-hot iron or being submerged in water, to prove innocence. If you survived unscathed, you were divinely declared innocent. If not, well, you got the idea. It's a system that sounds both medieval and downright terrifying by today's standards. Without police to investigate, everyone was a witness, investigator, and jury rolled into one. Gossip and reputation mattered enormously, and the court of public opinion could be as powerful as any official verdict. Families took justice into their own hands sometimes, leading to feuds and vendettas that could last generations. This personal approach to law and order made medieval communities both close-knit and precariously volatile. In some towns, the local leaders or elders acted as judges, but their power depended on respect and consensus. They didn't have police to enforce their rulings. Instead, they relied on community cooperation or force from loyal retainers. So, the medieval justice system was a living, breathing drama, public and unvarnished. It reminds you that order without police was fragile, often harsh and deeply human. You're now deep in the daily life of medieval families, where the absence of police means the safety of your home is squarely on your shoulders, and your weapon rack. Unlike the modern world, where you might call a security company or dial emergency services, medieval households had to prepare for defense themselves. Families armed themselves with whatever they could lay their hands on: swords, axes, bows, or even simple farming tools turned into weapons. Picture your kitchen table doubling as a weapons display, a sturdy club, a sharpened pitchfork, and perhaps a dagger tucked under the hearth's edge. Learning to wield these tools wasn't just a pastime, it was survival training. Parents taught children not only to respect weapons, but to be ready to use them at a moment's notice. Even the youngest might have a small wooden sword for practice, growing up with the mindset that danger could appear any time. A quirky tidbit: some families kept murder holes, or narrow slits in their homes, small openings through which defenders could pour boiling water or shoot arrows at intruders. It's like your medieval version of a home security camera, but with a splash of hot tea. Historians still argue whether the average peasant had real skill with these weapons, or if the defensive measures were more about intimidation than actual combat effectiveness. Either way, the threat of violence was real enough to keep families vigilant. Training was informal but constant. No standardized martial arts schools for most people. You learned by watching, copying, and practicing in the fields or around the hearth. The village blacksmith wasn't just forging horseshoes. He was often a weapons maker and sometimes a fighting coach. Interestingly, in some areas, women were known to be quite proficient in using weapons: bow, staff, or even swords. Their role in home defense could be crucial, especially when men were away at war or tending fields. This goes against some modern stereotypes about medieval women being helpless. Your home might also have physical defenses: reinforced doors, heavy locks, or even small keeps, designed to delay intruders until help could arrive. But help was a loose term. Sometimes help meant your neighbors grabbing their own weapons and rushing over, hoping to scare off the threat. So, in a world without police, families weren't just passive victims. They were armed, alert, and ready, creating a patchwork of personal defense that kept the fragile peace. You couldn't just rely on someone else to protect your home. You had to be your own first responder. You now find yourself following the clatter of hooves and the shimmer of armor as mercenaries and knights enter the scene, a medieval private security force, if you will. Without a formal police system, the wealthy and powerful turned to hired muscle, knights for the aristocracy, and mercenaries for anyone who could afford them. These professional warriors were both protectors and symbols, their gleaming steel a deterrent to troublemakers. Imagine a knight riding into town, his chainmail clinking with every step, sword sheathed but ready. For the lord, he was a status symbol and a sworn defender. For the common folk, a reassuring presence or a reminder of who really held power. Mercenaries, on the other hand, were less about loyalty and more about the paycheck, often hired for specific jobs like protecting a merchant caravan or enforcing a lord's will. Interestingly, some mercenary groups were surprisingly organized and disciplined, almost like early private armies. They came from diverse backgrounds, including disgruntled soldiers, adventurers, or even former criminals seeking a more legitimate profession. Historians still argue whether mercenaries were reliable protectors or just unpredictable wildcards who could switch sides when the price was right. You might find it amusing that some knights followed a strict code of chivalry that dictated how they should protect the weak and uphold justice. Yet in practice, many were more interested in personal gain or glory. The reality was often messy, full of political intrigue, betrayals, and battles not always fought for noble causes. Knights trained for years, mastering horsemanship, swordsmanship, and strategy. Their skills made them formidable protectors, but also formidable threats. Towns with a knightly presence often enjoyed relative peace, but that peace came with the cost of heavy taxes to fund their upkeep. Mercenaries filled a gap when lords needed extra muscle, especially during wars or internal conflicts. But their presence could also escalate violence, as rival factions hired competing bands of soldiers. For commoners caught in the crossfire, mercenary armies could be just as dangerous as the enemies they fought. And here's a quirky detail. Some mercenaries used bizarre disguises or tricks, like dressing as monks or using war elephants in rare cases, to intimidate foes. It was early psychological warfare, proving that protection wasn't just about strength, but also about the element of surprise. So, mercenaries and knights were the medieval equivalent of personal bodyguards and SWAT teams rolled into one, sometimes heroic, often complicated, and never dull. In a world without police, these warriors made the difference between survival and chaos. You walk now on the dusty roads connecting villages and towns, where the greatest dangers are not ghosts or wild animals, but the bandits and highwaymen lurking in the shadows. Without police patrols or highways guarded by official forces, traveling was a risky business. If you're out after dark, your chances of being stopped and relieved of your possessions skyrocket. Imagine clutching your satchel tightly as the sun sets, hearing the crack of twigs behind you. The fear isn't just in your imagination. Bandits thrived on the lawlessness of these roads. They were opportunists, sometimes organized gangs, other times lone wolves. The threat was constant enough that travelers developed a whole toolkit of survival tactics. One such tactic was traveling in groups, caravans of merchants and pilgrims banding together for safety in numbers. These convoys often hired armed guards or knights for protection, paying handsomely for the chance to reach their destination unscathed. Historians still argue how common such banditry truly was. Some records suggest it was widespread, while others hint that fears might have been exaggerated, a medieval version of stranger danger. Here's a quirky detail. Some highwaymen wore masks or disguises, like the famous Robin Hood legends, making them both feared and oddly romanticized in folklore. They might have been criminals, but their stories have survived as tales of rebels fighting an unjust system. In reality, bandits were ruthless. They set traps, used hidden paths, and sometimes colluded with corrupt local officials to evade capture. Without an official police force, catching them was tricky, and often fell to local lords' retainers or hired mercenaries. Travelers also developed clever tricks to avoid trouble. For example, some carried small bells or loud instruments to alert others quickly, while others disguised valuable goods or traveled only during daylight. Inns along the way doubled as hubs for news and warnings, where travelers exchanged stories about safe routes or the latest bandit ambushes. Medieval prisons might be the medieval version of don't get caught, as punishment was swift and often brutal. Bandits who were caught could expect anything from public execution to exile, sometimes without a formal trial. So, the roads were as much a battlefield as a pathway, where your survival depended on luck, preparation, and sometimes the kindness of strangers, or the speed of your horse. You now glimpse the shadowy corners of medieval justice, prisons and punishments, the grim substitutes for modern policing and courts. Unlike today's orderly jails with cell blocks and daily routines, medieval prisons were often temporary holding pens, grimy, overcrowded, and designed more for deterrence than rehabilitation. They were less places to serve time and more dreadful waiting rooms for harsher fates. Picture yourself shackled in a damp stone cell where rats skitter and the smell of decay clings to every surface. Prison was often a place of torment, used to hold criminals until trial or execution rather than a sentence in itself. The idea of serving time to pay your debt was alien. Punishments were swift, brutal, and public, meant to remind everyone what happened if you crossed the line. Medieval punishments ranged from the humiliating, like the pillory or stocks where you were exposed to the scorn and sometimes abuse of your neighbors, to the downright terrifying, whipping, branding, or worse. Public executions were not only punishment, but spectacles that reinforced order. It was justice by community spectacle, not courtroom procedure. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. Some prisons were also known as debtors' prisons, where people who couldn't pay their debts were locked up, sometimes indefinitely. Not exactly a friendly debtor's rehab. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of such harsh punishments. Did they really deter crime, or simply breed fear and resentment? Without a police force to investigate or enforce laws, the threat of brutal consequences was a primary tool for maintaining order. Sometimes, people were locked up not for crimes, but for political reasons or accusations of heresy, blurring the lines between justice and power plays. A medieval prison could be a place of cruelty and injustice wrapped in the cloak of law. You might find it surprising that some castles had their own dungeons, though the grim reality was often less dramatic than Hollywood depicts. These dungeons were sometimes just cellars or cramped rooms without proper ventilation or light, prisons as punishment and warning. So while medieval prisons weren't comfortable or fair, they played a critical role in a society where formal policing was non-existent. They were the dark reminder that the consequences of crime were severe and often final. No bail, no appeals, no second chances. In a world without police, prisons and punishments were the blunt instruments keeping the uneasy peace, where your fate often hinged on the community's will and the Lord's justice. You find yourself amidst the bustling workshops and crowded streets where medieval guilds thrived, a surprising source of order and protection in a world without formal police. These guilds were more than just trade unions. They were tight-knit communities that regulated not only craftsmanship, but also the behavior and safety of their members. Imagine walking into a blacksmith's forge or a weaver's shop, where membership in a guild meant more than just shared skills. It meant protection, mutual support, and enforcement of rules. Guilds maintained quality standards, settled disputes among members, and often had their own methods of disciplining wrongdoers to protect their reputation and livelihood. Some guilds even organized their own patrols or watchmen to safeguard workshops and warehouses from thieves or rival guilds. These groups acted as early private security, blending trade interests with community safety. Historians still argue how far guild authority extended and whether their enforcement could rival official law. Here's a quirky fact. In some guilds, breaking the rules could lead to fines, public shaming, or even expulsion, which was a serious blow since it cut you off from work and community. Losing guild membership was like losing your job and your social network all at once, a medieval version of social and economic exile. Guild halls often served as meeting places and mini-courts where conflicts were resolved. Their influence could be so strong that lords sometimes deferred to guild judgments in local disputes. The guild's power wasn't just economic, it was social, and in some cases, political. You might be surprised to learn that some guilds developed secret signs or passwords to identify members and exclude outsiders, adding a layer of security and trust. It was a medieval form of membership-only protection. The guild's protective role extended beyond business. They often provided support for sick members and their families, almost like an early form of social insurance. This solidarity helped keep communities stable in turbulent times. So, guilds weren't just about making a living. They were crucial players in maintaining order, safety, and trust among medieval artisans and merchants. In a world without police, they built their own systems of protection, proving that community enforcement could be powerful if limited in scope. You now step into the often overlooked but vital role women played in medieval protection, far from the helpless damsels of popular myths. In homes and communities without police, women were often the first and last line of defense, wielding influence and sometimes weapons to keep their families safe. Imagine a farmhouse kitchen where a woman keeps a sharp knife within reach, not just for cooking, but as a tool for protection. When men were away, at war, tending fields, or attending lordly summons, women managed the household defenses. They organized watch duties, kept watchful eyes on property, and sometimes even trained in self-defense. Here's a quirky but true detail. Some women carried small, easily concealed weapons like daggers or knives, which were not just practical, but also symbolic of their autonomy and authority within the home. In some cases, noble women learned swordsmanship to protect their estates during turbulent times. Historians still argue whether these instances were widespread or limited to exceptional cases, but records show women actively participating in defense, negotiation, and conflict resolution. They were community mediators, advocates, and sometimes even leaders during sieges or disputes. Women also wielded social power that translated into protection. Their roles in marriage alliances, managing estates, and influencing local politics could deter violence or settle feuds. Their knowledge of the community's undercurrents was a powerful tool in maintaining peace. Interestingly, some medieval laws allowed women to defend their property with force, and local customs often supported their right to protect themselves and their families. This blurs the line between the domestic and the martial in a fascinating way. You might smile at the thought of a woman wielding a broom or rolling pin as a weapon, but such resourcefulness was common. Everyday items doubled as defensive tools in the absence of formal policing. So women's protection in the medieval world was multifaceted: physical, social, and political. They held a quiet but formidable power, ensuring survival in a world where security was never guaranteed. Their stories remind us that protection was a shared responsibility, not just a man's domain. You find yourself at the crossroads between the informal and the official, where royal edicts and sheriffs tried to stitch together a semblance of law enforcement in a fragmented medieval world. The crown might have been far away, but its reach stretched through appointed officials who wielded authority, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with real power. Imagine a royal sheriff riding into your town, cloak billowing, badge in hand. Not quite a cop, but close enough to inspire both hope and dread. Sheriffs were tasked with keeping peace, collecting taxes, and overseeing courts. Their power was vast on paper, but in practice, their influence depended on local support and personal strength. Royal edicts, laws issued by the king or queen, tried to establish rules across the realm. These proclamations might ban certain weapons, set curfews, or define punishments, but enforcement was patchy. Sheriffs and local officials often struggled with limited resources and conflicting loyalties. A quirky fact: sheriffs sometimes employed posse comitatus, a posse made up of local men summoned to assist in law enforcement. Think of it as medieval crowd control. But these posses weren't always eager or effective, leading to delays or even escalations of violence. Historians still argue whether royal officials were genuinely effective or merely symbols of distant authority. In some regions, sheriffs abused their power, becoming oppressors rather than protectors. In others, they were vital links between the crown and local communities. You might be amused that sheriffs sometimes doubled as tax collectors, making them deeply unpopular figures. Not exactly winning community trust, but in a world without police, they were one of the few centralized forces attempting order. Royal edicts also laid the groundwork for early criminal laws, shaping ideas of property rights and personal safety. These laws influenced local customs, sometimes clashing with established village traditions and creating tension. So, sheriffs and royal edicts represent early steps toward modern policing, a mix of authority, enforcement, and political complexity. They remind us that medieval law enforcement, was evolving, uneven, and often contradictory. You hear the distant clang of a bell cutting through the quiet dusk, a signal that something's amiss, a warning system in a world with no sirens or emergency calls. Villages and towns relied on simple but effective alarm methods: bells, horns, smoke signals, and sometimes even fires set on hilltops to spread urgent messages. These ancient alarms created a fragile web of communication crucial to survival. Imagine the village bell ringer, perched high in the church tower, poised to toll the bell in a special rhythm that everyone recognized. Different patterns might signal a fire, an approaching enemy, or a call to arms. It was an early warning system run by trusted villagers, and its sound could summon neighbors faster than any messenger. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, people used trained animals like dogs or birds to alert them of danger. Pigeons might carry messages, while dogs barked furiously at the first sign of trouble. Not quite a 911 dispatcher, but effective in its own way. Historians still debate how reliable these signal systems were. Some argue they were prone to errors or false alarms, while others point out their vital role in coordinating defenses and community responses. Miscommunication could be costly, but silence in the face of danger was worse. In some mountainous regions, smoke signals sent messages across valleys, creating a visual network of alerts. It's a testament to human ingenuity, using the landscape itself as a communication tool in the absence of modern tech. Alarm systems also served social purposes, like marking curfew times or signaling market openings. The community depended on these cues to structure daily life and maintain order. Imagine the tension as the bell tolls unexpectedly at night, every ear strained, every heart racing. Would the villagers rally to defend their homes, or was it a false alarm? The balance between vigilance and exhaustion was delicate. Without police or radios, these simple alarms were lifelines, binding communities together in moments of crisis. They turned isolated homes into a networked village where everyone's safety was intertwined. So the ringing bell was more than a sound. It was a symbol of shared responsibility, a call to action echoing across a world without instant communication. You step into the warm glow of a bustling medieval inn, a sanctuary for weary travelers, and a crucial piece in the protection puzzle. Without police or modern security, hospitality wasn't just about food and rest. It was about safety, trust, and community networks extending beyond village borders. Picture a tired merchant entering the inn after a long day on treacherous roads. The innkeeper offers not just a bed, but information. Warnings about bandits ahead, advice on safe routes, and sometimes a promise of guarded passage. Inns acted as informal safe houses, places where travelers could find refuge and join caravans for mutual protection. Interestingly, some inns had their own watchmen or alliances with local militias to safeguard guests and goods. This mutual protection was vital for commerce and communication across the fractured medieval landscape. Historians still debate how organized these networks were, but there's no doubt they played a role in reducing risks on the road. Here's a quirky fact. Some inns had secret tunnels or hidden rooms to protect guests from sudden raids or feuds. It's like a medieval panic room, complete with creaky floorboards and maybe a trapdoor. Hospitality was a serious business, and a reputation for safety could make or break an inn. Guests preferred places known for trustworthy hosts and secure stabling for horses. A bad reputation could mean empty rooms and fewer coins in the till. You might be surprised that some travelers carried letters of introduction or safe conduct passes, handed out by nobles or merchants, to gain entry to certain inns or estates. These documents worked like medieval VIP passes, granting you protection under the host's watchful eye. Inns also doubled as information hubs. News of danger, political changes, or epidemics spread quickly among guests, helping communities prepare or avoid trouble. So, while castles and lords provided distant security and village watchmen guarded the local fields, Inns were vital nodes in a wider safety network. They offered more than food and drink. They offered a lifeline in a world without formal police. As you sip your metaphorical ale by the hearth, it's clear that hospitality was as much about protection and trust as it was about comfort. You step into the shadowy world where law and order blur with personal vendettas. Vigilantism and blood feuds were harsh realities in a world with no police to mediate disputes. Justice wasn't always blind or impartial. It was personal, raw, and sometimes terrifyingly brutal. Imagine a dispute over land or honor spiraling out of control, families taking matters into their own hands. Without an official force to intervene, revenge could stretch across generations, with cycles of violence that no court could break. Blood feuds often started small, an insult, a theft, but quickly escalated into deadly confrontations. Here's a quirky detail. Some communities developed elaborate peace rituals to end feuds, like the exchange of symbolic gifts or public apologies, showing how deeply people craved stability despite the violence. Historians still debate how common blood feuds really were. Some argue they were exaggerated, while others see them as a defining feature of medieval justice. Vigilantes acted as self-appointed judges and executioners, sometimes hailed as heroes, other times feared as outlaws. Their authority came from reputation and strength, not legal backing. Think of them as the medieval wild cards, sometimes necessary, often dangerous. Interestingly, in some areas, groups called watchmen or posses could act with legal sanction to pursue criminals, but their line between lawful and unlawful was thin. When official forces were weak or corrupt, vigilantism filled the void. You might find it ironic that the very absence of police often made people more vulnerable to violence, yet communities still found ways to enforce their own version of order, even if it meant taking the law into their own hands. These personal justice systems often led to social instability, but also strengthened community bonds as neighbors united against common threats or feuding families. So, while the idea of vigilantes today might seem thrilling or romanticized, medieval vigilantism was a complex, often grim reality, where justice was as much about survival and pride as fairness. You find yourself drifting into the murmur-filled taverns and whispered corners where medieval surveillance thrived, not by CCTV or wiretaps, but through a network of spies, informants, and the ever-powerful grapevine. In a world without police, information was the currency of safety, and those who controlled it held real power. Picture a local informant slipping quietly into the Lord's Hall, bearing news of plots, crimes, or rival factions. These individuals operated in the shadows, gathering intelligence that could prevent attacks or uncover conspiracies. Spies were hired by lords, merchants, and even churches, weaving a web of secret watchers that kept the fragile peace intact. A quirky tidbit: some spies used ingenious methods to pass messages, like using coded songs, hidden notes in bread, or even carrier pigeons trained to fly secret information. Not exactly encrypted emails, but effective for the time. Historians still debate the scale and impact of medieval espionage. Was it a common practice, or reserved for high-stakes political games? Regardless, it was a critical part of how communities maintained order when formal police were absent. Gossip, often dismissed today, was a powerful surveillance tool back then. News traveled fast in tight-knit villages, and a suspicious stranger's movements rarely went unnoticed. Social pressure and reputation acted as informal policing mechanisms, encouraging conformity and discouraging crime. The church also played a role, with confessors sometimes acting as unofficial informants, blurring the lines between spiritual counsel and surveillance. This mix of sacred and secret added complexity to medieval order. Interestingly, some communities employed watchers, whose job was less about brute force and more about observation, keeping eyes open, listening carefully, and reporting unusual behavior. These watchers acted like human sensors, vital in the absence of patrol cars or security cameras. So, While medieval society lacked the technology and formal structures we rely on today, it created an intricate system of surveillance rooted in human networks. In that delicate balance of secrecy and exposure, safety was negotiated, maintained, and sometimes shattered. You now walk beyond walls and watchmen into the vastness of nature itself, where geography and climate become unlikely guardians in a world without police. The rugged terrain, dense forests, and harsh winters weren't just challenges. They were natural deterrents against violence and crime. Picture a village nestled in a valley surrounded by steep mountains. Those peaks aren't just pretty backdrops. They act as barriers, making access difficult for marauders or wandering criminals. In some regions, thick forests and rivers created natural borders, limiting movement and isolating communities enough to keep trouble at bay. Interestingly, harsh winters could also serve as unintentional security measures. When snow blanketed the land, travel became risky, roads impassable, and banditry less frequent. Historians still argue how much climate actually influenced medieval crime rates, but it's clear the seasons shaped daily life and security strategies. A quirky detail: some villages deliberately built on islands or peninsulas, using water as a natural moat, making surprise attacks more difficult. It's nature's own castle wall, free and effective. Community size also mattered. Small villages fostered tight-knit relationships where everyone knew each other's business, creating a natural social surveillance. Strangers were easily spotted, and trust, or distrust, was built on shared history and faces. On the flip side, isolated communities sometimes suffered from lack of support if violence did break out. Without neighbors close by, help was slow or non-existent, making self-reliance essential. You might smile at the idea that, for all their beauty, nature's defenses were brutal teachers. Starvation, cold, and isolation could be just as deadly as any human threat. In that sense, survival depended on adapting to the environment as much as avoiding criminals. So, geography and climate formed an unspoken part of medieval protection. Natural forces that shaped where people lived, how they defended themselves, and the rhythms of their lives. In a world with no police, the land itself was a silent but potent guardian. You arrive at the crossroads of scholarship and folklore, where historians debate the very nature of medieval peace and protection. Was the medieval world a brutal, chaotic battleground, or did a complex web of social norms, institutions, and customs create a surprising order without police? Some scholars argue that medieval communities were more stable than popular culture suggests, held together by shared values, mutual dependence, and effective informal justice. They point to the roles of lords, guilds, village watches, and churches as evidence of functioning social order. Others emphasize the darker side: frequent violence, feuds, and the arbitrariness of justice that could swing wildly based on power dynamics and personal vendettas. The absence of centralized law enforcement left many vulnerable, especially peasants and women. Here's a quirky fact. Some medieval towns had night watchmen who patrolled with lanterns and rattles, sounding alarms, but their effectiveness is debated. Were they genuine protectors, or more like noisy nuisances? Historians still disagree. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Medieval protection was a patchwork, sometimes effective, sometimes brutal, and always deeply human. It combined physical defense, social pressure, religious authority, and evolving legal systems. You might find it ironic that the medieval world's lack of police fostered communities both tightly bonded and fiercely divided. Trust and suspicion lived side by side, shaping lives in ways still visible in modern legal and social systems. So, as we look back, the medieval era teaches us that peace and protection don't always need formal police forces, but they require complex networks of cooperation, authority, and sometimes sheer resilience. The debates continue, reminding us that history is rarely black and white, more like a tapestry woven with both shadow and light. You settle in for the final leg of our journey. reflecting on what life in a world without police truly meant, and what lessons it leaves for us today. Medieval protection wasn't neat or comfortable. It was raw, personal, and often unpredictable. You lived under the watchful eyes of neighbors, the shadow of your lord's knights, and the tolling of church bells that could summon help, or herald doom. In those days, safety was a collective effort, woven through the feudal bonds, village watches, guild loyalties, and church sanctuaries. Everyone had a role to play, from armed knights to vigilant women wielding kitchen knives, from town criers ringing bells to whispering informants. There was no 911, no police radio, no forensic labs, just people relying on relationships, reputation, and sometimes raw courage. Imagine the resilience it took to live like this, the constant awareness that danger might come from any shadow or stranger. You learned to read your environment, to trust selectively, and to defend what was yours fiercely. It's a stark contrast to the security many enjoy today. Here's a quirky reminder from our journey. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? It's a perfect metaphor for the medieval mix of superstition and practical defense. Protection was as much about belief and community as it was about steel and strategy. Historians continue to debate just how safe medieval life really was. Was it a brutal survival game, or did these overlapping systems of protection create an order that, while imperfect, was enough? The answer isn't simple, much like the era itself. As you close your eyes tonight, consider the incredible human spirit that thrived without modern police forces, relying on trust, courage, and community bonds. It's a reminder that security comes not just from authority, but from connection. Now, breathe deeply, let the day's worries fade, and drift into sleep knowing that while medieval protection was rough, you, in this moment, are safe and sound. Now, slow your breathing as the images of stone walls, ringing bells, and watchful eyes gently fade. Let the warmth of community and the quiet hum of distant village life lull you deeper. In this stillness, remember that safety is woven from many threads: trust, vigilance, courage, and care. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest deep, and your waking world kind. Sweet dreams.